Arnab Kundu. Arnab, you're here?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Would you kindly share your slides?
Yeah. Actually, Abhishek has to first answer.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Is it visible?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay, and you can hear me also.
Yeah, so our next speaker is Arnab Kundu from Shah Institute, and he'll be telling us about OTOCs and early time chaos.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
And I have about 25 minutes, right?
You have 25 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes of questions.
Okay, thank you. So let me begin by thanking the organizers, especially Alok, for organizing this wonderful conference. It would be very nice to meet in person, but at this time, this is also great. What I will try to talk about is actually some sort of elaborate version of what Srichetan talked about this morning. But I will try to actually focus on a little more broader aspects and probably try to impress on you what it is that that we are trying to do in the longer term. So, and in doing so, it would be mostly, or at least a large part of it would be reviewing or introducing, discussing very elementary things that I apologize if you are way too familiar with. But I hope it's not going to be boring or useless. Okay, great. So with that apology, let me start. Great. Okay. So first, I should acknowledge really great people that I have been fortunate enough to work with. And what I will be talking here today is largely based on the first two papers here with Srichetan, Bobby, Somnath, and Vaishali. And then finally, we had we also had the great fortune of Krishnendu joining us from a very different perspective, more from a condensed matter kind of perspective, in essentially trying to do some computations that we are currently figuring out. And it's great because it's a new perspective, but it's also at the end of the day doing the same or similar calculations in a more in a wider sort of framework, and trying to ask physics questions. So that's great. And Srichetan already talked about it today, so I'll not really be talking about the results that we have there. I will mostly talk about some results that we have in these two works and how it tries to connect to the bigger picture and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is the rough outline. So I'll start with a brief motivation and some introductory remarks. In particular, I'll try to basically say that I'll try to impress on you that dynamics is an important aspect to think about in physics in general, no matter what kind of questions you are interested in at the end of the day. And if you want to understand dynamics, it's a very difficult problem at the same time. So one has to have a starting point. And in particular, for this talk, I have chosen this class of correlators, which are abbreviated as OTOCs these days. And basically, that's what I will introduce. And in particular, more than introducing them, perhaps more important is that I'll try to also state that, or rather make a statement, how it connects to various other interesting ideas and perspectives in physics that people are using, including efforts of experimentalists that are going on currently. So that I find is extremely exciting, this is perhaps a good point to try to think about this class of correlators in general, in any theory that you like. And then with this sort of broad discussion or motivation, I will try to move on to a particularly precise setup, which is I'll try to talk about quench and chaos. And this will also have a very precise meaning. I'll obviously not be talking about the most general kind of quench that you can think about or that you can do. In fact, here we will take literally baby steps to something that are the simplest in some sense. And here the point would be that in the simplest cases, nonetheless, what you get at least seem interesting to us for a variety of reasons. So that would be my purpose to establish at this point. Of course, general notion is that here, in some sense, we are probing non-equilibrium physics, but of course, it's not the non-equilibrium physics of an arbitrary nature. It's a very specific kind of non-equilibrium dynamics, but nevertheless, it has structures. And then I will try to go on to some specific, what I call some specific but general lessons. I hope you will appreciate this phrasing once we get there. This is where most of the result discussion of results will take place. And then I'll try to conclude with some speculative remarks, perhaps some definitive follow-ups that one can do, and so on. Great. So let me start with perhaps the broadest possible perspective, which is to say that dynamical aspects are undoubtedly ubiquitous in nature. There's no doubt about that. And if you want to do a collider experiment or a tabletop experiment or a cosmological experiment or what have you, you will have to address dynamical aspects in one way or another. As ubiquitous as these aspects are, they are also very difficult in general. That I don't think anybody will disagree with. So if we want to understand dynamics properly, it is a seriously challenging problem in general. In particular, perhaps to this audience, I could appeal to particular corners of this dynamical problems. For example, if you want to understand dynamics for strongly coupled quantum field theories in general, or in particular, for example, quantum dynamics of black holes in quantum gravity. I think at some point these questions will need addressing anyways. So these are going to be these are already challenging, and I'm just trying to say that these are important problems to understand in general. But of course, every challenging problem has its problem in the beginning. Where do you really begin? And one particularly interesting beginning point is perhaps to look at correlation functions, and that has been happening for decades. In fact, it goes back all the way to I think it's fair to say that understanding correlators and their analytic structures, etc., is one way of understanding traditional critical exponents, universality, and so on and so forth in a quantum field theory setup, for example, that we cherish now. However, those are only a handful of examples in some sense, and I think it's also fair to say that there is no structured, systematic understanding of correlators and their analytic properties or the power of it in full generality. There certainly isn't, although there are many structures which you can explore. And in fact, in some sense, recent years have seen such a push, for example, to understand analytic constraints on correlators, in particular, these class of out-of-time ordered correlators that I'll be talking about. So two examples I'll give you is, well, the well-known MSS chaos bound, for example, is a precise example of this, where analytic constraints does put a bound on the correlator or how it behaves. In fact, I'll also allude to Sandeepan's talk later in this conference, where I think he'll be talking about a much more general class of constraints that one can get with similar analytic completion arguments, for example. So the point is that this, I think, broadly speaking, is a very important problem and a very interesting problem nonetheless. And there are lots of things to do. However, the trouble is, or the challenge is, in some sense, is that it's not clear immediately how these constraints or how much these constraints on correlators could give us control over a system, for example. So one can start from that. One can start from an abstract point of view like that. Instead of doing this, the point of view that I will be adapting in this talk is mostly like a crime scene investigation, where someone just basically collects evidences, and it's going to be somewhat messy. But before we warrant or issue a warrant, that's the way we want to proceed, at least for the time being. So that would be the approach. Okay. So let me start with this notion of OTOCs, and I apologize if this is very because this is very elementary, but I'll go through it very quickly. So as we all know, that classical dynamics, in classical dynamics, the notion of chaos is very important, and it is defined in terms of trajectories, classical trajectories. In particular, as the picture shows here, I hope you can see my cursor. If you have two nearby trajectories at initial point, if you have a highly sensitive system, a dynamical system which is highly sensitive to initial conditions at later times, at sufficiently later times, these trajectories will start deviating from each other by a large amount. In particular, This is a very functional, quantitative way of estimating how these two trajectories could be differing from each other. And in particular, they could be exponentially growing in time. And the exponent of that has a name. It's basically one of the important ingredients in this part. It's called this Lyapunov exponent. So that's the classical part. And basically, the bottom line is, if I know the phase space, if I know the phase space structure, if I know my Poisson brackets and so on and so forth, I can compute this for a particular system. Great. So once we go to quantum mechanics, of course, trajectories go out of the window, but what we have is still the correspondence principle in a semi-classical regime. So what we do is we take the commutators, excuse me, we take the Poisson brackets and lift it to commutators. That's the correspondence principle. And generally what you can define is a quantity like this, which I call Cn of t. So basically this is just, as you can see, just a commutator raised to some power, where the commutator is between two operators. One is evaluated at a time t and the other one is evaluated at 0. T and 0 has really no meaning. It's just to emphasize that you could put it at two different times. I'm suppressing the spatial direction altogether. It's not going to be important. And you could do this computation in fact in any state. Although I have written here, there is a subscript beta here because generally thermal states or thermal-like states are the ones we want to consider in these cases, but you don't have to. I mean, this is just a set of correlators. In fact, this can define a sequence of correlators depending as indexed by n, for example, for any gauge invariant observables that you have, local observables that you have in your theory. In particular, if you take n equal to 2, you can expand this out. And if you expand this out, it will have two pieces. One is the standard time-ordered correlator that we are very familiar with. The other one, which we may not be so familiar with, are these out-of-time ordered correlators. And as the visual cue suggests, basically, as you can see, that the operators have time arguments which are alternating here in the out-of-time ordered correlators. So that's all really really all that there is to it. From a pragmatic point of view. So these are the correlators, if you wish, that I want to talk about a bit more. Okay, sorry, I went too fast. Okay, good. So what is the physics of such correlators? Well, so as I said, these questions pertains to dynamical questions. So we are trying to understand dynamics, and if you want to understand quantum dynamics, you can already organize your question in various time scales. So for example, here is a cartoon of this. So this horizontal line here, horizontal arrow here, denotes basically ascending time scale for a quantum mechanical system. It could be quantum field theory, it could be anything that you like, but it's quantum mechanical. And there is an very early time, which I call T dissipation. It really doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the dissipative thermal physics, but it's similar. The point is that this time scale is given by order s to the 0. So this is order 1, if you wish, as far as entropy is concerned. And then there's a time scale I call T scrambling, or rather it's known as T scrambling, which goes as logarithmic of S. And then there's a very large time scale, which is known as the Heisenberg time scale, which grows exponentially with the entropy. So for all the discussions that we have, or for most of the OTOC discussions that take place in the literature, the entire non-trivialities are happening around this time. So you can think of it as a physics which is happening near the scrambling time. And that's what I will call early time, just because in the literature, late time chaos means something else in quantum dynamics, and that has to do with this physics at the Heisenberg time, which I'll not talk about. So everything that I have to say here will actually be strictly limited to the scrambling time region, and certainly not for parametrically larger time scales. So what is the physical content of such correlators? Well, some very simple things that come out of these correlators are basically an emergent light cone. In other words, if you compute correlators, correlation functions, for example, even a 2-point function, in a quantum mechanical system, you do see an emergent light cone, in the sense that the correlator is order 1 inside and vanishingly small outside, exponentially small outside, and so on and so forth. So this light cone structure is what comes out of OTOCs cleanly. Of course, this Lyapunov exponent that I just mentioned in a slide back, and also something called butterfly velocity, which basically defines the light cone. So all these data are essentially just defining an effective or emergent light cone. If you like, this is basically like the Lieb Robinson kind of light bulb. Now, I just want to mention a couple of lines here. I mean, I'm of course not an expert in this, but I think it is rather interesting that right now this class of correlators are actually connecting many ideas, starting from dynamics of black holes to, for example, actual measurements with cold atoms and so on. And also connecting in doing that, connecting also ideas of operator growths, quantum information theoretic quantities, and so on and so forth. In particular, I just listed a few very representative experimental efforts or connections that are going on right now. So just to sort of impress on you that this is not completely an abstract thing. This is actually something that people can measure in the lab right now. That much precision they have. So how do we compute such objects? Well, in a field theory, if you give me a field theory, there are certain approaches, but there is no really extensive or exhaustive set of techniques that exist right now. So for example, what I will be considering or focusing on is basically just Euclidean computations, perhaps the simplest of them, because I'm going to choose conformal field theories, and then some analytic continuation accordingly. But there are other techniques, for example, large N diagrammatic. If you are powerful enough or motivated enough, you can do that. And then there are some very interesting papers by these people recently where they are trying to use a mean field type description to compute such correlators. But I will have nothing to say about that, at least today. Okay, so some very basic details. So as we all know very well, that if you want to compute a vacuum correlator in a Lorentzian quantum field theory by analytic continuation, what we do is very simply compute the following. So these T's, for example, this is the Lorentzian correlator. What you do is you take your time coordinate and make it analytically continuate, such that if all phi's are Heisenberg operators, you can show that this correlator is nothing but what I have written here on the right hand side. And of course, at the end of the day, you take all the epsilons going to 0. But in doing that, what you ensure is because of these time differences, these tau 1, 2s, and so on and so forth, it introduces a set of regulators. In this case, it will have a set of 3 regulators because I have chosen 4 fields, but in general, you could do it generally, of course. And this set of regulators have to be properly sequenced with an order so that the entire right-hand side is well defined, in the sense that all of these regulators have to be damped, right? I mean, it cannot grow. If it grows, then the right-hand side is not well defined. So in order to well define this object, it all automatically gives you an ordering of this epsilon, and by definition, that orders your operators. So this is a simple way of understanding how vacuum correlators in Lorentzian QFT are ordered. Of course, if you want an arbitrary state, which is what we actually want generally, then this trick will not work. But what will work is the following: that if you start with the general state psi, which may not be a normalizable state, what you do is you just introduce by hand a regulator. Where this tau naught is a parameter that needs to be identified with some physical parameter that is in the system. But nonetheless, you can do it. And when you do it, because of this damping or because of this regulation, your correlation function is well defined. So here in the violet box, I have shown 2 examples. For example, this one where phi 1, phi 2, phi 3 are time ordered. And that happens if you choose a sequence of epsilons in this way, for example. On the other hand, if you choose a sequence of epsilon where this epsilon 1 and epsilon 2 are switched, then you find an operator ordering, which is where phi 2 and phi 1 are also switched. And note that this is a correlator which is being computed in a non-trivial state or in an arbitrary state, psi, not necessarily a vacuum state. And because you are computing this correlator in an arbitrary state psi, even 3-point functions are non-trivial. So generally, we talk about 4-point functions when we talk about non-trivial time ordering and so on and so forth, but that's not necessarily true for an arbitrary state. Okay, so that's the very basic premise. Now let me come to the quench part, or let me just introduce what it is. It's a very basic thing. Quench is essentially a quantum mechanical process where you change the Hamiltonian in time. In particular, this picture basically gives you an idea of what is happening. So for example, you start with a Hamiltonian H1, And then, well, that remains for a while. Then suddenly at some point, you change the Hamiltonian to H2, which is a completely different Hamiltonian. And this change can be very slow, which is called an adiabatic quench, or it can be extremely fast, which is usually known as abrupt quench. So if it is abrupt, if it is extremely fast, which is the case that I will be, in fact, that I will be talking about, I will not be talking about at all the adiabatic part, although that is also very interesting. So then what happens is essentially you start with the state here, which is, for example, say the ground state of this Hamiltonian H1. But on the right hand side, you evolve this state, which was a ground state of H1, but with the Hamiltonian H2. So this, of course, this psi is no longer a ground state of this H2. In fact, this is the way you will create an excited state for H2 altogether at late times. But this is generally the setup, and the kind of questions you ask or the quantities that you want to compute are basically correlation functions in this state as it evolves in time. So this is completely I'm completely choosing a Heisenberg, working in a Heisenberg picture here. In particular, there are two classes of physics questions that one can ask. One is basically the physics of thermalization. And the other one is essentially physics of universality. If, for example, you choose this H2 to be a CFT Hamiltonian. So in particular, if you quench with a CFT Hamiltonian, then you would expect, because of CFT, because of that symmetry, you will have many universal features surviving at long time limits, and indeed that happens. So these are the two kinds of broad questions that you can focus on with this setup. So here, of course, I'm going to consider a critical quench. And in this setup, talk about OTOCs and its physics. Okay, so for example, a very basic example of universality is if you just compute one-point function, you can define a relaxation time scale, and if you take ratio of two relaxation time scales of corresponding to two different operators, it's just a ratio of their dimensions. So that's an universality. From a two-point function also, you can define an universality, and you can get what you get out of it is an effective temperature that comes out. That has been discussed in detail by Gardy and Calabresi over the years, for example. But what is peculiar here is that these universalities do not really care about what CFT you chose. For example, you could have chosen a minimal model, or you could have chosen a large C holographic CFT. These statements are nonetheless true. So these correlators are obviously not capturing the fine-grained information, and that's not completely surprising. But what could capture the fine-grained information, for example, higher point correlators, which is what we are after with these OTOCs. So let's see what comes out of it. Before that, let me just very quickly describe what goes on. Well, as I said, that if you want to compute the correlator, you have to, first of all, compute in an arbitrary state. You have to do this regularization. And that regularization essentially means for CFT that you're computing a correlation function inside a strip with operators located in this, operators arranged in this manner, for example. And you can make a standard conformal map from a strip geometry to the upper half plane. And basically what will happen is that this W will have an image, and the 3-point function will now become a holomorphic part of a 4-point function, which you now have to evaluate. And this spatial operator arrangement is useful or very important because of the following reason. Because what you want to do is the following, or what you want to capture is the following: that the 4-point function, which is a function of the cross ratio, should have the following feature, that the cross ratio should have certain kinematics. In particular, as t goes to 0, at small times, it should go to 0, as well as for large times, which is these two limits, for example. And as t is equal to x, which in that picture is basically the operators entering each other's light cone, it should become bigger than 1, because then what will happen is in the plane, the cross ratio will actually cross the branch cut and go to the second Riemann sheet. This is important for OTOCs. If this is not bigger than 1, then you do not get a out of time ordering. You then get a time ordering, in fact. So this is what is ensured by ordering the epsilons, as was described by, demonstrated by Roberts and Stanford some time back. The point is that you can do this with 3-point function also, which is what we had done. Good. So what comes out of this calculation is the following. So you take, first of all, the simplest example that we all know and love is the large CCFT. We know it's chaotic, we know it's holographic, and all those nice features are there. If we now implement all of this prescription, it's just a black box. You just have to do it, and you will find a set of interesting answers, and that's the following. So this f of t is the OTOC, and it has this structure. So as you can see that it grows exponentially in time up to t star, and this lambda L is given by essentially 2 pi times t effective, where this t effective was again the same t effective that we read off from the lower point functions. So lower point functions told us that this Kardicke-Calabresi states or quench actually looks like effectively thermal, and it is indeed so for large CCFTs. In fact, you can also argue it is maximally chaotic in the sense that it saturates an analog of the chaos bound, for example. And more importantly, again, what you have here is a scrambling time, which goes as log C, and this scrambling time is what separates these time scales between tau 0 and t star. So tau 0 sets a time scale and t star sets a time scale, and they are far apart, where you actually do see this non-trivial evolution happening. So I should point out that, of course, this calculation you could also do in minimal model, or you could do in other CFTs, for example, an orbifold CFT, where you get a very different result. For minimal model, you don't get any evolution at all at late times. It's just a constant, completely trivial in that sense, which basically says that it's a highly integrable model. You can't really do much. You can't really create much chaos, quote unquote, into it. On the other hand, for orbifold CFTs, it nonetheless exhibits a power law growth in time. However, a power law growth is not really enough to give you a scrambling time because it doesn't really define a scale. So there is no notion of scrambling time, so to speak, for this case. Good. So let me just collect the circumstantial evidence again.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
You should try to wrap up within 5 minutes, including questions.
Yes, I will. Yes, I will. Good. So, so first of all, based on the large CFTs, you can already make a statement that the Lyapunov exponent is actually bounded by the mass gap, the initial mass gap that we chose, this tau naught, the scale that was set by tau naught. And this can be further argued based on the fact that this 3-point function that we started with or we discussed actually does satisfy all the assumptions that goes into MSS bound proof, for example. So you would expect that this would hold up. On the other hand, there are very interesting explicit examples or explicit cases worked out, which are non-critical quenches by these people here, which actually does obey this bound. So there is some concrete evidence to trust on or to think that there is indeed a bound. However, there's an interesting thing that you can already observe, which is the Kardicke-Calabresi state is a very special state. In that, it's not actually an eigenstate of the CFT Hamiltonian. In fact, it is not really a typical state at all. It's usually dubbed as an atypical state because it's very special. So we do not quite have the CFT arguments that go along the lines of typicality, that if you have a heavy state in CFT, it does behave like a thermal state. That is not necessarily true here. So in that sense, it's peculiar as well as interesting. So with that, I'll very quickly, in the next couple of minutes, tell you that what I have been saying so far, you could also very easily do with some inhomogeneity. And well, inhomogeneity can be, of course, motivated on many grounds. I mean, if you want to connect things to the real world, as well as perhaps even formally, it's not such a bad thing to think about, especially now when people are thinking about quantum field theory with lesser and lesser amount of symmetries, for example. So anyways, that's just a side remark. But the point here is that even with inhomogeneity, if it's small enough, there is already a technology that exists that will tell you, in other words, a set of maps that will tell you how to go from basically the inhomogeneity that is described here by a wiggle line to the upper half plane and carry out this exercise, which you can, which we did. And what you find is the following. You can, of course, follow your nose, etc. But roughly speaking, a structure like this comes out. And here, as you can see, that inhomogeneity is a perturbative parameter here. It's by definition perturbative. This entire premise is perturbative. So we cannot trust it when the inhomogeneity is large. But nonetheless, what happens is the structure becomes like this. So you have first for the standard Lyapunov growth that exists for the homogeneous quench. But on top of that, now you have also some other exponential piece. And later in the conference, I hope Shandipan will tell you that there are actually an infinite number of constraints that you can have on such behaviors. And all I want to say here is that by choosing an appropriate inhomogeneity, you can indeed saturate one of the bounds that he seems to be getting. So that's an interesting observation. I don't really have anything profound to say about it at this point. So finally, last point is the following. I said that the orbifold CFT has a polynomial, has a power law growth, not an exponential growth. So it did not have a scrambling time. But if you have a small inhomogeneity, it's a small parameter in the system. And the point is that if you just carry out your calculation, what you find is that that small parameter goes into define for you a scrambling time right away in the otherwise system which did not have a scrambling time. So all I'm saying is that this is non-trivial because you might think that a weakly coupled system would also be able to do that, but it's not known to be so. Usually, hierarchy in scrambling and any other earlier time scales is given by a large number of degrees of freedom. But at least in these cases, within the approximations, etc., we are working in, you can indeed create you can indeed zoom into the chaotic region if you wish. And perhaps this could be relevant for experimental protocols and so on. Also, I do not have anything more precise to say about experiments here, but just an interesting observation. So let me end here. As I hopefully try to convince you that this set of correlators are important as well as largely unexplored because they are hard to compute. Of course, they contain finer grained dynamical information. That's not surprising, but the question is how much? That's a hard question to answer. That's a hard question to answer. And of course, these correlators actually involve what I call commutator class operators. Basically, any operator that you can define as commutators or nested commutators of local operators. And these class of operators encode very, very interesting information about the quantum mechanical system. For example, how fast a local operator grows and so on and so forth. Information spreading in general. Of course, there are also traditional quantum field theoretic questions like how it knows about critical exponents, RG flows, and so on and so forth. Also, there are statistical mechanical perspectives or questions that one can ask to what extent you can actually distinguish between typical and atypical states of a Hilbert space by these correlation functions. I think these questions are relevant for quantum field theory as well as holography, and generally ties with this analytic, how much analyticity can constrain, etc., etc., etc. So with that, I will just end by saying that, well, as I started by saying that, we're doing crime scene investigations, they are underway, and hopefully in due course, we'll be able to produce clean warrants, exhibits, and legal documents. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ananda, for a very nice talk. Any quick questions or comments? I mean, we don't really have a time for that, but any quick, yes. So yes, Rito Broto, there's one question. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the nice talk. Just one question regarding the last part of the talk that you said. So like introducing a small homogeneity, you said like in systems where you had like power law growth and where you couldn't define the scrambling time, introducing a small inhomogeneity allowed you to do so. Can one think of it this physically, that this introducing this inhomogeneity somehow breaks the integrability, and from that can one argue that there should be?
Yes, that is certainly true. I would agree with that. But the point is that
this true in general or
carefully. Yes.
Yeah, I'm asking. I'm asking that whether this is true in general or is it like true?
I don't think it's known. So, for example, if you take a sufficiently integrable system in a classical mechanics, your CAM theorem tells you that by perturbation you can't break integrability. Right. So, in some sense, the fact that minimal models don't really respect these OTOCs they don't show respectable behavior or they don't care about them, is sort of a manifestation of that. What remained without the perturbation also remains true with the perturbation.
Okay.
So if it's sufficiently integrable, no, but yeah, otherwise it might.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot again, Ananda, for a very nice